Hello, welcome to Holistically Speaking. I am Morella DeVoe, your host. Our mission with Holistically Speaking is to be the avenue through which the voices of holistic health reach you at the time you need it most. And today we're talking about a topic that has become increasingly prevalent. You've probably been hearing about it. You maybe have asked yourself a few questions about it. It is gluten. And I'm joined today by Dr. Mike Stadtmauer, who was with us on the show. Thank you for joining me again.
Thank you.
On the show we were doing last time, all of a sudden you talked about the subject of gluten, and we said right on the spot we needed to do a show about it because there are so many people who are struggling with, they're not sure what, and it could be related to gluten from what we're going to hear about from you today. So can we start by defining what is gluten? Because I know people are hearing about it, but they're not even sure what it is.
Right. So gluten is a protein that's found in wheat, rye, and barley grains. And it's really a bit of a misnomer because gluten is actually found in all grains. Rice has gluten, corn has gluten, all grains have gluten, this grain gluten. But it's only the glutens in wheat, rye, and barley that break down into these kind of troublesome pieces that we respond to. So what we really respond to, we really shouldn't use the term gluten, we should use the term gliadin.
Okay.
Because these glutens break down into pieces called gliadins, and then that's what our immune system responds to.
And you have a little like family tree graphic to illustrate this or show people what you're talking about. Is that the one that?
Yeah, so you can see just how wheat, rye, and barley are related to the other grains. And the further away you get from barley, the less likely those grains are to cause a problem.
So is this also, because we're seeing on this graphic that oats are right next to the troublesome grains.
And those are oats is the next most likely grain to cause a problem. Some people with celiac have a real, true reaction to oats, just like they would to wheat.
Gotcha. Whereas other people who might be sensitive to wheat don't necessarily have a reaction.
Tolerate oats just fine.
Okay. So why is it that it seems like we're hearing all about this now, but I never heard of celiac disease or gluten or any issue with gluten growing up, and now this seems like the new trend where you go to a restaurant and people you ask for something without the pasta or the bread or whatever. Oh, are you gluten sensitive? It's so commonplace now. Why is it that we're hearing about it so much now?
Yeah. So part of it, it is certainly a fad right now. It's kind of the latest food health craze, which is, in my opinion, a little unfortunate because it takes away from the realness of it for so many people. And if we want to understand why this is a problem, we have to start with understanding, this is going to get a little technical, but we'll move through it quickly, the structure of gluten itself. And gluten is different than any other protein that we consume or have consumed as humans because it contains large amounts of this amino acid proline. And all proteins contain this amino acid proline, but gluten has many, many proline to proline bonds and is called a prolamine. And there's been a lot of research showing that our digestive systems, our stomachs, are very bad at breaking these proline to proline bonds. So our digestive systems have a much more difficult time handling this protein than any other protein that we've ever been exposed to.
And so one thing that I've heard and read in some articles have to do, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but they say that over time the breeding of wheat has over time developed what would be like a super wheat. So the wheat that our ancestors were eating maybe 300 or 400 years ago was very different than the wheat that we're eating now. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely accurate. And it's not even 300 or 400 years ago. It's 50 years ago.
Okay.
The wheat was very different. And if you do research on wheat and how wheat has evolved, you'll see that there's been this drive to make wheat more and more drought resistant. And unfortunately, what makes it more and more drought resistant is higher and higher amounts of proline.
And is that proline also what makes wheat sticky, what gives wheat that kind of sticky, gooey, bouncy factor or not so much?
I don't believe so. I think that's just gluten, the nature of
Gotcha.
gluten itself.
Okay, because what's interesting to see, compare the gluten grain products like the breads and the pastas versus the non-gluten grain, they're just not as bouncy, you know.
Yeah, that's a side effect of gluten itself. It's a very spongy molecule.
Gotcha. So you also you have another graphic for our viewers that shows the differences in the proline.
Yeah, so if we take a look at the content of proline within different grains, we can see that we can basically draw this line where wheat, rye, and barley have the highest amounts of proline compared to other grains, and that's a big part of why they cause an immune response.
Gotcha.
Because they're less broken down by the digestive system, and they're more likely to be identified as an issue.
So since you're bringing up this idea that the proline creates an immune response, I'm all of a sudden just wanting to ask you, so what sort of what would constitute an immune response? Is that?
So it's what happens is because these proteins are not broken down as well, we have larger protein molecules, which are called peptides, making their way deeper into the digestive system than they're really supposed to be. And then that causes some issues with how the immune system recognizes those peptides. And it kind of knows that something funny is going on there. It's not supposed to be seeing these very large pieces. And so it, if the certain genetics are there and some other conditions are present, it will identify those peptides as problems, as invaders, as essentially bacteria, and attack them.
So the body starts attacking these proteins, which you know shouldn't normally be the cause,
Right.
So how common is the issue with gluten? Is it really something that's that prevalent in the population, or?
So that's been changing over time, and we have some interesting studies that have compared comparable blood samples, population blood samples from 40, 50 years ago and today. And what it shows is that there is this about fourfold increase in the number of antibodies that we're seeing to gluten show up in the human population. And it's because of all these issues with how wheat has been evolving, but also has to do with the quantity of wheat that we're eating today. So wheat basically comprises about 20% of the American diet right now, which is very different than, again, even 40 or 50 years ago. Much more concentrated within the digestive system, much more likely to cause an issue. And so I mentioned before a little bit about genetics. There are some genetic mutations that have to be present in order for this response to really be kicked off. And about 30% of the people have this mutation, but we think only about 1% of the population goes on to develop true celiac disease. And so we have this huge amount of people that have this great potential to have a response to gluten without it actually going to celiac disease.
So then, so a large amount of people might have a reaction, but only a very small number of people actually have celiac disease.
Have diagnosable celiac disease.
So what is the difference between the actual celiac disease and then the reaction that other people might have?
So there's a whole range of different reactions that people can have. In order to have celiac disease, you have to have essentially complete flattening of the what are called little villi within the small intestine. And that's because of the inflammation that the gluten reaction causes. And that's kind of the gold standard definition of celiac disease. And anything short of that complete flattening is really not celiac disease.
So for our viewers, what you're talking about, the villi are like the little hairs, the filaments inside the intestines, right?
Yep.
And so flattening means that for people with celiac, then the inside of their small intestine is completely smooth, or?
Yep.
Okay. So that's a difference.
Yeah, exactly. But there can be differences there where the villi can be halfway flattened. And that's not called celiac disease, even though there's obviously an issue there. There can be antibody responses to gluten without a real flattening of the villi, that also is not true celiac disease. That's called latent celiac disease, where they're having this very obvious immune reaction to gluten, but they don't have the flattened villi, so we can't really call it celiac disease. And then other people have just an inflammatory response to gluten without having either the flattening or the antibodies. And that also, of course, is not celiac disease, but it still is a major issue for these people.
It's a major issue. So let me just make sure that I have covered the bases on here. But what's immediately coming up for me is saying, okay, if the majority of the people aren't really diagnosable celiac, but many people, as many as maybe 30% of the people, are potentially having a reaction to gluten, what is that looking like for them? How do they, because I'm thinking about the person who's watching at home, and maybe they're in pretty bad shape and they haven't even thought that gluten could be at the cause of their issues. So how is this showing up for them?
Yeah, so the number one presenting complaint of even people who are diagnosed with celiac disease ultimately is fatigue, just straight fatigue.
Yeah.
Most of the people who have celiac disease, and I should say that the numbers right now suggest that we're only diagnosing about 10 to 15% of the people with celiac disease. The other up to 90% of people are going undiagnosed,
Right.
because they're not being recognized. Up until a few years ago, we thought that celiac disease was like diarrhea many times a day and a lot of stomach pain.
Yeah.
But that's actually the minority of people. The majority of people who have celiac disease have just fatigue. We see a lot of chronic anemia, people that have been told their whole lives that they're iron deficient or they're always turned away from giving blood. People who have a history of different inflammatory conditions that are not really explained, asthma, eczema, migraines. We see those symptoms as a direct side effect of the gluten response in many, many cases.
Right.
And people's family histories can be helpful as well. They have those issues, they have other autoimmune diseases that are present in the family and a big inflammatory history. Hypothyroidism and antibodies, especially when antibodies are present to the thyroid, that's been very, very tightly tied to celiac and to gluten responses.
So it's like a picture of autoimmune conditions that goes hand in hand with celiac disease is common.
Absolutely. The person, and when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about celiac disease. We're talking about anybody who has a reaction to gluten can have these issues. You don't have to have celiac disease to have chronic anemia and asthma and eczema and migraines, all caused from gluten.
Okay.
So yeah.
So earlier you mentioned something about the outcomes potentially being far worse with someone who has just general inflammation from celiac, and I don't know if not celiac, from gluten. And I don't know if I was understanding that correctly, but can you help me and our viewers understand why this is so important that people pay attention to this?
Yeah, so there was a very interesting study done where they tested this huge number of people, almost like 30,000 people, and they found that a certain number of people had true celiac disease, a certain number of people had antibody responses to gluten that were obvious, and then a large number of people had just inflammation without any antibody response detectable. And so the people who have antibody responses are told, okay, stop eating gluten. You have this antibody response, you probably shouldn't eat it.
Yeah.
But people who have just inflammation, they're not told that because they don't have that, findable response.
Yeah.
And so they're not given that correct advice to stop eating gluten. So they go on with this lifelong issue of chronic inflammation, which leads to all kinds of issues. And there's a graphic to show.
Yeah, so if we can show that third graphic of the different conditions that might be linked to this.
So the inflammation from gluten kicks off what's called the NF-kappa B pathway. And that inflammatory pathway then leads into all these other different inflammatory pathways that are very highly destructive. And that ultimately causes, as you can see there, pain and inflammation. Cardiovascular disease is major, insulin resistance, autoimmune disease, cancer, all of these issues can come directly from the gluten response.
So insulin resistance is another way of saying diabetes. So
insulin resistance is kind of pre-diabetes, but on that road.
So what you're showing us here is that gluten could be potentially linked to almost all of the syndromes and conditions that afflict, the leading causes of death: cardiovascular disease, autoimmune and rheumatic disease, and the syndromes of our times, diabetes and.
Absolutely. What's not on that list is Alzheimer's as well. Well, neurodegeneration is on there, and there's been
Alzheimer's and dementia.
Absolutely.
And linked to wheat. Wow. And even cancer. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. So you told us a little bit about the different ways or symptoms in which this is showing up: the fatigue, the anemia. Are there? You also. What were some of the other ones that you mentioned? Like eczema. You mentioned eczema and asthma. So. What are some of the things that maybe people need to start considering if they're questioning whether this might be an issue for this? What's the next step for them?
So people can always try to do a gluten-free diet. It's all the rage right now.
Right.
But there's issues with that because there have been studies that have shown that in people who have a real reaction to gluten, they can have a continued response that can last for a couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks, from a single exposure. And so creating a gluten-free diet is difficult, especially if you're going to not be cooking all of your own food. But people can try that and just see if they feel better that way.
Yeah.
And if you've had all of these issues your whole life and you're getting headaches and all these other things and your digestive system is crazy, and you stop eating gluten and all that goes away, that's better than any test, I think.
Right.
But a lot of people are interested in testing and they want to see in black and white that they have this response or they don't. And then there's a lot of different options out there. There is the standard celiac testing, but that's only going to catch people with celiac disease, true celiac disease.
Right.
And even then, it's not a very good test. It misses maybe somewhere between 15 and 20% of the people. And so there's other tests. There's a company called EnteroLab, which you can get to on the web, and you order yourself these stool kits that test for the gluten antibody response through the stool, which is a very sensitive place to test for it. It's very good testing. I like that testing a lot.
Yeah.
There's testing that we can do through the hospital system here, where they look at more food sensitivity and intolerance reactions rather than like reactions where you eat a peanut and have to go to the hospital, those kinds of reactions.
Yeah.
And that also can be very good testing and really demonstrate for people that they have this significant immune response to gluten.
Right. Where the food sensitivity tests are, the sensitivity is like the delayed response where you might, like you said, you might not break out in hives or you might not have anaphylactic shock, but the next day you might be fatigued or have abdominal pain or something.
Exactly.
And it's hard to pinpoint what it was. So testing can be the way to go for some people.
Yes.
And so in terms of avoiding gluten, doing a gluten-free diet, what would be some of the basic recommendations that you might have for people or that you tell people how to go about it?
Well, it's all about really educating yourself. And there are so many things that you have to learn. Ultimately, it's all about avoiding the glutens within wheat, rye, and barley and the products that are made from those. So you have to understand that, for instance, oats, we talked about oats earlier, most oats are processed on the same equipment as wheat, and so they're full of wheat dust, and so you have to get special gluten-free oats.
Right.
And that soy sauce is made with wheat, and a lot of ketchups have wheat, and salad dressings have gluten byproducts in them, and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I really push education and really try to get people to do a lot of reading and really understand what they're dealing with before they dive in.
Right. The other thing that I tend to find can be a slippery slope is trying to replace with gluten-free products everything that currently has gluten in it.
Right.
So trying to find gluten-free muffins and gluten-free pasta and gluten-free crackers and all of that, because I find in helping people, and I don't know if this is maybe what you might have seen, that if you try to eat like your grandparents ate, from the garden, meat, vegetables, eggs, none of that has gluten. And if you eat potatoes and broccoli and, Brussels sprouts and et cetera, none of that has gluten. And so it's what you were saying earlier, right? That we've become so heavily reliant on bread products that we think that a gluten-free diet needs to substitute all of those bread products with gluten-free options.
Right. Which the person can do. Thankfully, all of those options are there for us now.
Right.
And you can go into really any supermarket these days and get gluten-free this or that.
Yeah.
Which is not always the best choice. A lot of the times those products are very highly sugared and they're really not made very well, and so they can cause other problems. But at least it makes it doable for people to kind of take that first step and see what happens if they do go gluten-free.
Right. Right. So I know that some people might try a gluten-free diet and they go all out and they feel like they're doing the best they can, and still they might not see the results, or maybe they're still noticing that they have some reaction.
Yeah.
So what might be some of the hidden sources of gluten that they are completely overlooking?
So there's a couple of different possible issues there. One is people getting exposed without them knowing it. And this happens a lot when people go out to dinner. They try to ask for something gluten-free and they think it's gluten-free, but it's really not, because the kitchen maybe doesn't know what they're doing exactly.
Right.
And so they can get exposed, and then, again, like I said earlier, have continued responses for many weeks. And that makes it very difficult then to assess how well you're doing on a gluten-free diet.
Right.
They can also be exposed to kind of hidden sources of gluten. There's gluten very often in shampoo, in all kinds of hair products and skin products and lotions and lipstick. And
you have another little graphic for that, right? That
there is. There's a little list of things that people can get exposed to. And all of these things have the potential. I've seen people, some of my patients, the turning point for them was when they switched their shampoo out for a non-gluten shampoo.
Wow.
We absorb things through our skin really quite well.
Yeah.
And so any exposure is a potential issue for the person.
So all of our personal care items, and even things like envelopes and stamps and
not anymore, because the stamps,
we don't lick them
right?
anymore.
Nobody licks them anymore, thank goodness.
But definitely important to look at personal care items, because we do absorb a lot through our skin.
Absolutely.
So, did you?
One other issue is the issue of cross-reactivity, and this is for some people a really major issue, where they've identified now, and they've done some very interesting testing here. So there was this one kind of very interesting study where they gave celiac patients casein, which is the protein in dairy, and they found that they had the exact same reaction as if they had just eaten gluten.
Wow.
Antibody response, inflammatory response, everything. And so there's this list of proteins. Dairy tops the list, certainly, but oats, rice, millet, coffee, chocolate, and a number of other proteins the body can kind of confuse for gluten, and you can get these cross-reactivity reactions that, again, make it very difficult to assess how you're doing on a gluten-free diet, because you continue to have these reactions. There's a company, I should mention, called Cyrex, C-Y-R-E-X, that does some very interesting testing on this front, looking at specifically these cross-reactions, and they also do a bunch of other gluten testing.
Yeah. So a question that might be popping for our viewers is, once someone has identified that they have a sensitivity to gluten, and they go on an all-out gluten-free diet, they eliminate it completely, is there a rebuilding? Can they eventually add it back into their diet? Do they heal from it and overcome it to a certain extent, or is this for the rest of their lives? What have you seen about that?
I would say in the vast, vast majority of cases, it's forever. In many cases, the issue, like I mentioned earlier, is genetic. And so with those genes turned on and activated, their immune system is always going to identify that protein as a problem for them. So in only very rare cases is there an issue where the person has a sensitivity to gluten that does not follow one of those pathways, and they can spend some time away from it and heal their gut and then come back to it, but that's exceptionally rare.
Yeah, okay. And so same thing for celiac disease. Once you have celiac disease, there's
that's definitely no going back from that.
So once those villi have flattened out, they don't.
Oh no, they can repair, absolutely.
Okay.
And yeah, you can heal from this.
But you can't go back to.
But you'll always have that antibody response. And the healing does, if we catch it early in life, if we catch it when they're kids, then healing is very, very good.
Right.
If we first catch it well into adulthood and there's been decades of damage, sometimes we're not able to totally repair that.
Right, right. So before we run out of time, I want to make sure that our viewers know how to contact you, because there might be a lot of people who are all of a sudden hearing, wow, I have anemia or fatigue or allergies or asthma or eczema or any of these things, and they could benefit from testing and working with you. Mm-hmm. So I want to show you Dr. Stadtmauer's contact websites. It's www.vermontfunctionalmedicine.com and vermontnaturopathic.com, and these are two different. One is your clinic, right, where you practice, and the other one is your personal website. Is that right?
Yep.
So two different ways in which you can contact Dr. Mike. Is there anything that we've left unsaid about gluten and what people need to be thinking about?
Well, probably a lot left unsaid. It's a big topic, but just in general, that despite the fadness of it all, these days, it really is very real for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And if you suspect it, then just go for it. Just go gluten-free, see how you do, and
yeah. And one of the things in terms of doing an elimination diet, one of the things that I've found is you need to do it for an extended period of time. Right. In order to really see a benefit.
So with gluten, we talk about a 3-month trial.
Okay.
Because we need to give the body time to kind of decompress from those inflammatory responses, have everything calm down, and to see what's going to be. You're not going to get anywhere cutting gluten out for a week.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not going to see anything. So really, for all of you at home watching this, we've learned that you could be having a gluten reaction, and anything showing up on your skin, pain, digestive complaints, and even, and much more so if you're someone who's struggling with an autoimmune condition. What it sounds like is definitely, even if it isn't celiac disease, people with autoimmune conditions should probably consider going gluten-free.
Yeah, there's a huge tie between gluten reactions and autoimmune conditions, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me and sharing so much about gluten and celiac disease. You've definitely answered quite a few questions for me, and I'm sure that you have for our viewers as well. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And I look forward to having you again, maybe talking about some other topics about naturopathic or functional medicine, because I know there's a lot more that we can explore in that subject. So
anytime.
I look forward to having you again. And thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next week again. Bye-bye.